Patrick Deneen's book, Why Liberalism Fails, sets out to give an account of the odyssey of the political doctrine birthed by Locke and nurtured by Mill, and also to show how the very decline in liberalism that has taken place is the result of the internal fulfillment of the concept of liberalism itself. More accurately, the very philosophical principles that underpin liberalism have led to the decline in the various societies that uphold liberal doctrine. This decline is mapped out on 4 fronts. Liberalism has failed in regard to politics, economics, education, and culture. The book, though it has one basic argument to make, spans several genres and thinkers to make its point. This being the case, I will review the book by looking at how liberalism's internal contradictions have manifested in the above-mentioned domains. But before that, I will give a summary of what Deneen thinks are the core problems of liberalism. Philosophical axioms of liberalism. The main point of departure of liberalism, its differentia, to use the language of classical philosophy, is its emphasis on voluntarism and the unfettered and capricious understanding of human nature and human freedom. This view of the human being was coupled with the idea that, in the proto-liberalism of Hobbes and the classical liberalism of Locke, that humans, in their essence, are inherently radically separate, non-relational beings that are out to satisfy their own self-interest. This being the case, the state and the laws that follow therefrom are but a necessary set of strictures that curbs the competing drives and desires of individuals predisposed to the advancement of their own egos. This vision of human nature has a reverberating effect on all social institutions. That is, the relationship of parent to child, husband to wife, and citizen to state is based upon the concept of consent. Relationships are understood in contractual terms. Deneen puts the point as follows. If this encompassing logic of choice applies to the most elemental family relationships, then it applies all the more to the looser ties that bind people to other institutions and associations, in which membership is subject to constant monitoring and assessment of whether it benefits or unduly burdens any person's individual rights. Close quote. The second major point of departure of liberalism is more subtle, but in many ways more pernicious. Pre-modern thinkers, for the most part, view reality as a cosmos, an ordered, organic, and hierarchical whole in which each part has a role to play in a great, vast unit. In this vision of the world, put forward by Plato, systematized by Aristotle, and brought to completion by the Neoplatonists, human beings had a particular nature, and it was up to them to integrate this nature with the workings of the cosmos as a whole. Human beings had an ultimate purpose, a telos, in this scheme of things. There was then a reverence for nature as a whole. The purpose then of pre-modern ethics was not self-creation, but self-moderation or self-limitation, the goal being to become who one should be based upon a template that nature had set for you. Liberalism rejected this idea and took it that the individual's purpose was to indulge in a process of self-expression and later self-creation, and as a consequence of this, nature would be seen not as a template that we should submit ourselves to, but rather as an obstacle that we should strive to overcome. This idea of overcoming nature split liberalism into 2 waves. Quote, the first wave of this revolution, inaugurated by early modern thinkers dating back to the Renaissance, insisted that man should employ natural science and a transformed economic system to seek mastery of nature. The second wave, developed by various historical schools of thought, especially in the 19th century, replaced belief in the idea of fixed human nature with belief in human plasticity and the capacity for moral progress. These 2 iterations of liberalism, often labeled conservative and progressive, contend today for ascendancy, but we do better to understand their deep interconnections. Close quote. One of the great advantages that liberalism has had over its political competition is that it has framed itself as a kind of non-ideological ideology. An ideology not bent on creating a new man like the fascists or class revolution like the communists, but simply as a framework that allows human nature to unfold itself in the least destructive way possible. This idea, to Jeanine at least, is completely false. Liberalism, instead of recognizing facts about human beings and building a system of politics based upon them, has instead created conditions that make the self-interested, atomized, non-relational humans it purports to describe actually come into existence. Moreover, liberalism has a strange feature that as it allows for greater personal autonomy for those under its sway, this comes with a coeval rise in the power and authority of the state. This comes to be because of liberalism's destruction of intermediate institutions between the individual and the state. Jeanine puts this point well. Quote, ironically, the more completely the sphere of autonomy is secured, the more comprehensive the state becomes. Liberty, so defined, requires liberation from all forms of associations and relationships, from family to church, from school to village and community, that exerted control over behavior through informal and habituated expectations and norms. These controls were largely cultural, not political. Law was less extensive and existed largely as a continuation of cultural norms, the informal expectations of behavior learned through family, church, and community. With the liberation of individuals from these associations, there is more need to regulate behavior through the imposition of positive law. Close quote. Thus, we can say that liberalism has terminated in a high concentration of state power and the liberation of the individual. But though liberalism has helped to eliminate intermediate institutions, it built and sustained itself by running off the power and cultural capital of said institutions. The founders of liberalism took it for granted that these institutions would be able to sustain themselves under pressure of atomization. In the first stage of liberalism, these intermediate structures faded passively, but in the late stages of liberalism, this passive decay was turned to active annihilation. This lack of self-limitation is also transferred to the economic sphere. In the free market system, there is a need for perpetual growth in order to keep the system going. Because of this, there is a push to extract massive resources from the planet to fuel the world economic engine. The above two aspects of liberalism, what was called the first and the second wave, have, in the United States, been locked in perpetual conflict. On the one hand, we have the liberals who focus on personal autonomy, which expresses itself through an unfettered free market. This tradition of liberalism is represented by Jean-Jacques and the Founding Fathers. In America, this first group is called conservative. On the other hand, there are those of the progressive tradition who calls for expanded government structures. These are called, well, progressives. The stunning thing about the relationship between conservatives and progressives is that they both expand the reach and extent of the state and the openness of the market and freedom of the individual. Jeanine puts this point well. Individualism and statism advance together, always mutually supportive and always at the expense of lived and vital relations that stand in contrast to both the starkness of the autonomous individual and the abstraction of our membership in the state. In distinct but related ways, right and left cooperate in the expansion of both statism and individualism, although from different perspectives, using different means, and claiming different agendas. Close quote. In the classical liberal theory of Locke, the goal of the state was to expand the liberty of its citizens by freeing them from constraining external circumstances and satisfying their appetites. A main domain of this expansion of liberty was commerce. Through liberalism's progression, it found that the markets and apparatuses necessary for their existence are not self-sustaining but require maintenance to continue to function properly. This being the case, the state grew larger in order to take on the demands of making sure the market ran better. The goal of this expansion of commerce and market opportunities is to give individual persons the context to actualize their fullest potentialities. The opening of the market gives more opportunities to choose and to differentiate and to define oneself through choice. In the past, according to Denis, economic structures were constrained by other interests such as religion, the flourishing of the family, and nourishment of communal life. These checks were eliminated in the name of opening up choice for more individuals. Hence, for Denis, conservatives only play lip service to the idea of traditional values. For example, the expansion of commerce and free markets has had as one of its effects the dissolving of communal bonds in religious groups that nourish family life in the name of an individualism that is persisted as given and as a descriptive claim of the nature of the human condition, but was actually a normative and prescriptive claim about how human beings should behave. Progressive liberalism, on the other hand, takes it that classical liberalism did not consider the fact that human beings were capable of more radical transformations, and they believed that the individualism of the past had to be overcome by a more nuanced form, which integrated the corporate and social aspects of society with the project of expanding a free culture of individual self-expression. We now come to, in our opinion, the most provocative, incisive, and salient portion of the text, the analysis of culture. According to Denis, liberalism has produced an anti-culture in which most forms of civic and communal life have been submerged by the globalized economy. This new anti-culture has three fundamental features. First, the conquest of nature. Second, presentism when it comes to time. This leads to a neglect of tradition and of our consideration of the ramifications of our future actions. Third, the erasure of the stability and significance of place. Now, these are the above three fundamental features of anti-culture, but the conditions that allows these features to become concrete takes two forms. Quote, anti-culture is the consequence of a regime of standardizing law replacing widely observed informal norms that came to be discarded as forms of oppression, and it is the simultaneous conquest of a universal and homogeneous market, resulting in a monoculture that, like its agricultural analog, colonizes and destroys actual culture, rooted in experience, history, and place. Close quote. With regards to the first of the above issues, the weakening of informal norms, this has as one of its conditions the breakdown of the continuity of human beings with nature that was mentioned earlier. This social breakdown also follows from the founding myths of liberals and proto-liberal thinkers, such as the state of nature myth. In the state of nature myth, there was no culture, and any semblance of one was a result of artifice and stricture. The assumption was human beings were inherently cultureless. The goal of liberalism, then, was to free the person from the constraints of culture so that they may indulge their appetites to the fullest. Liberals advanced ideas that loosen the power of community and cultural forces in the name of greater freedom and equality. In reality, this was done to allow vices and appetites to run rapid. A healthy culture is rooted in time and place and respects nature not as an obstacle, but as the given that conditions our relationship with each other and ourselves. This relationship to nature fosters feelings of gratitude and humility. An example of how different approaches to nature can produce anti-cultural results can be found in agriculture. Quote, modern industrialized agriculture works on the liberal model that apparent natural limits are to be overcome through short-term solutions whose consequences will be left for future generations. These solutions include the introduction of petroleum-based fertilizer that increase crop yields, but contribute to hypoxic zones in lakes and oceans. John Dewey expressed the two fundamental ways of looking at nature as the savage view and the civilized view. The savage view comports itself to the limits that nature has set for it and lives in accordance with said restriction. The civilized view of nature sets itself the goal of overcoming nature, making nature submit to human beings. Liberalism not only alienates people from place and the natural environment, but also from time. Social contract theory envisioned a new way of looking at the relationship between past, present, and future. Social contract theory, grounded in the state of nature myth, saw human beings in a timeless and historyless situation through, quote, a thought experiment intended to be applicable at any and all times, close quote. The progressive form of liberalism, too, is caught in this presentism, for despite its supposed future orientation, it partitions the future from the present. It takes it as axiomatic that the future will have norms and values that have superseded our own to such a degree that it will be unrelatable to us in its superiority. This being the case, each generation chooses to live for itself, since it cannot fathom a meaningful connection to the future. This idea of each historical epoch or generation being a self-contained unit with its own distinctive temporal horizon, Deneen calls fractured time. De Tocqueville, who Deneen quotes here, links the presentism in American liberal democracy with a loss of an aristocratic tradition that links all its citizens from different class stations in a single lineage, and made them look to the past and see themselves temporally continuous with what came before. Lastly, liberalism makes us lose our sense of place. It made placelessness a central aspect of its state of nature myth. Hobbes said that humans sprang, quote, from the earth like mushrooms and grew up without any obligations to each other, close quote. The place where one is born is but an accident of history, and one is under no obligation to have any special loyalty or attachment to it. As far as technology is concerned, one of the most salient features of the way those in liberal society relate to technology is the following. Those in liberal societies tend to be technological determinists. That is, they take it that technological progress cannot be abated, and that the best we can do is alter our disposition towards the inevitable changes. Secondly, technology is seen as acting upon us and transforming us. Deneen wants to complicate both these views. First, Deneen says that in the United States, our relation to technology is based upon the idea of liberty as autonomy, in contradistinction to the ancient idea of liberty as self-mastery or self-control. Secondly, our idea of technology is conditioned by the political technology of our Constitution. The result, quote, liberalism introduces a set of norms that leads us, ironically, to the belief that technology develops independent of any norms and intentions, but rather shapes our norms, our polity, and even humanity, and inevitably escapes our control, close quote. Deneen says that the above idea, that technology develops independent of any norms, is illusory. The basic idea is that axioms of liberalism are in fact what condition the way we relate to technology, an idealistic reversal of the materialistic analysis that we are usually given. Deneen quotes an article written on the effects of Facebook, which states, quote, loneliness is one of the first things that Americans spend their money achieving. We are lonely because we want to be lonely, close quote. Of course, Deneen would likely add that we want to be alone because of the atomizing effects of liberalism. In order to show that the relationship we have towards technology is not a necessary one, Deneen turns his attention to the Amish and shows how they refuse certain technological advancements/arrangements if they are seen to be dangerous to the community. Moving on to the last substantive section of the text that I will deal with here, the section on the degradation of citizenship. The great innovation of liberalism was that it based itself on the idea of the free consent of the people, but at the same time, liberalism weakened the very institutions that would energize strong democratic participation. It did this by equating democracy with the conditions necessary for the expression of full individuality. So, as long as it is the case that democracy gives the semblance of enhancing the exercise of autonomy in the forms of rights, wealth, and power, then the fact that the democracy that we have is hardly influenced by our participation is, quote, not only an acceptable, but a desired end. In this sense, liberalism encourages the abandonment of self-rule, instead opting for libertine choice and provision in the state. Let this suffice for a summary. Now, what are we to make of the thesis of the text, namely that liberalism is decaying because of the fulfillment of its own internal logic? There are some issues that we have with the argument. First, there is the issue of parochialism. For though the essay has broad sourcing and spans many authors, it primarily focuses on ways that liberalism has corroded institutions in the United States. One wonders if the social, civic, and communal decay that has happened is actually the result of liberalism achieving its full manifestation, or if it is rather the result of certain eccentricities in the United States causing the decline. Put another way, is the problem a fully instantiated liberalism, or the way that liberalism has manifested itself in United States culture? This criticism, then, is one of method. In order to demonstrate that liberalism is destroying itself through its own inner fulfillment, it would be good to compare how this is happening in more detail in other nations as an attempt to separate the different stages of liberalism's life cycle. For example, one might be able to link the current state of liberalism in, say, India to a previous state of liberalism's development in the United States. So though Deneen does focus on some global issues in the text, he does so mainly tangentially. Additionally, and this is the biggest issue with the text, Deneen seems to give an overdetermination of the historical influence of liberalism and its impact in the contemporary world order. Deneen says, for example, that, quote, the second wave of this liberal revolution begins as an explicit criticism of this view of humanity. Thinkers ranging from Rousseau to Marx, from Mill to Dewey, and from Richard Rorty to contemporary transhumanists reject the idea that human nature is fixed. Close quote. Now, as is obvious, Marx was not a liberal, and Rousseau's place in the history of political thought is somewhat ambiguous. Many of the phenomena that Deneen covers in the text, the eroding of communal ties, the fracturing of temporality, the increase of atomization, and the instrumental view of the relationship between humans and nature, arose from causes that antedate liberalism's ascendancy, and in some cases its creation. Many of the problems that Deneen wants to lay at the feet of liberalism and its internal contradictions coming to fruition are simply issues that show themselves in society that have entered into late, post, or meta-modernity. Liberalism is of modernity. Modernity is not of liberalism. Now, this need not be an invalidation of the general thesis of the book, but more a complication of it. For it could be the case that the conditions of late to postmodernity are such that they provide the necessary, or less problematic, congenial conditions for the full unfolding or manifesting of liberalism, which in turn amplified other aspects of the modern condition. That aside, our main issue is that liberalism's development has not been placed in the context of modernity in which it rightly belongs. And this being the case, the text gives the appearance that liberalism is solely or principally responsible for far more that can rightly be credited to it. Lastly, one would think that an analysis of some of the new or more modified forms that liberalism has taken will be called for here. That is, we hear nothing of neoliberalism. It seems odd in a text such as this that focuses on liberalism's collapse under its own fulfillment, that nothing is said of the revamping it undertook in the 20th century. This would be like, to use an analogy from the history of Western philosophy, someone wrote a book about how Platonism had collapsed under its own internal logic in, say, 630 AD, but did not include any mention of the Neoplatonists. The reader wants to know how the theories of Friedrich Hayek and von Mises contributed to liberalism's supposed failure. Criticism aside, Denis has given us a provocative exploration of liberalism's 400-year odyssey. The most enduring contribution of the text, in my opinion, is the argument about how progressive and classical liberals, conservatives and liberals in American political parlance, engage in a dynamic interchange which has as its result both the enlargement of the state and the domain of personal liberty. This is a penetrating insight that can be used to make sense of many of the political development in the states over the last 60 years or so. So while Denis' text is not comprehensive enough in its argument to warrant being labeled a classic, it contains some insights that do warrant that designation. Necessary reading for those with an interest in the history of political ideas.